be honest, when you first started studying this play, you probably thought, oh no, this is going to be a nightmare, I won't understand it, it's not funny, and I don't know what it means. And now you love it, right? Brilliant play. And I hope you've seen the 1968 Peter Hall filmed version, the movie version on YouTube, which is a great watch, really, and puts everything in a really understandable context. So what's worth saying about this play? Well, to any student taking Year 11 exams in literature now, or coming up soon, you have to know the play, you have to read it, watch it, annotate it, and then once you do that, your ability to sort of analyse and talk about it will be something that actually arises from knowledge rather than, trying to fill in gaps, really, and trying to fill in holes based on not having engaged with it. So that's absolutely number one. But then when you know the play, I think you can start thinking about what's really the intention. We know sometimes Shakespeare writes a tragedy, sometimes Shakespeare writes a comedy. What's it all about? And people who know a little bit about Shakespeare, you might know that he made a comedy that's rather a tragedy called Romeo and Juliet, which was a star-crossed lovers sort of story where external factors were such that their love would never have an opportunity to sort of come to fruition in the real world because of like family feuds or class structures or racism, a number of things. The world's been like that for a long time, sort of where certain kinds of love is sort of like prescribed and certain kinds of love are proscribed, as in disallowed. So, he's absolutely expert in highlighting that in Romeo and Juliet, as a tragedy. But then quite similar themes actually occur in Midsummer Night's Dream as well. Whereas Romeo and Juliet actually died, the play within a play in Midsummer Night's Dream, which is the artisans, the workers who have a theatrical troupe and come to Athens to perform, at the Duke's wedding. They actually go through a drama called Pyramus and Thisbe, which I understand is an ancient Babylonian story or myth, again, about star-crossed lovers, and in this case, they talk through a wall. That wall symbolises the barrier between them, really. And in a similar way to Romeo and Juliet, one sort of like kills himself because he thinks she's dead. He thinks he's seen her being taken off by a lion. The lion that the players are really worried about. They're worried that the women are going to be scared. But of course it's absurd because they don't look like a lion. But so Pyramus and Thisbe both die and Romeo and Juliet both die. But in Midsummer Night's Dream, everyone's laughing. So if you know the play, and I hope you do, or you've just watched the movie or whatever, you've got the players performing at the wedding, or rather after the wedding. There's a few hours entertainment before everyone goes to bed. And they come on stage, but the script is bad. The introductions, like I'm a wall, I'm a lion, are really absurd. Bottom is obviously overacting. So the more educated and the more sort of like privileged class who are watching are just sort of like laughing. They can't take it seriously. So, that's kind of intriguing because on one hand, Shakespeare will be like, mourn with me the death of these star-crossed lovers as a sort of a sincere tragedy. And at another time, he's more like, well, it's just a bit of fun really, people dying, stabbing themselves, can't take it too seriously. So, which one are we meant to really believe, in a sense? Well, in this context, in this Athenian context with, all the confusion and problems that occurred from the beginning of the play where, two people loved Hermia, but only one was approved by the father, and it wasn't the one that Hermia loved. All that's been resolved now. So they're all back in. Their love story is actually okay. you know, and they look on this tragedy, you know, with a lot of humour. And I think, to me, the dynamics and the content suggest that Shakespeare, the writer, intends us, you know, to some extent, not to take our trials and struggles and heartbreaks too seriously. Although that's paradoxical, because how could you not take suffering seriously? You know, and yet, doesn't the theatrical layout of this play point to a perspective from which, and this doesn't have to be an external perspective, it could be a perspective that you have of your own life. You know, I'm going to survive this. You know, isn't there some absurdity to this? And, you know, although obviously pain is real, you know, do we have to treat it as final or absolute in any sense? You know, is there a funny side to it? And, of course, these plays were performed, you know, amid great pestilence, you know, amid the quintessence of dust that, like, Elizabethan England might present to you, because you might be murdered, you might be conscripted, you might be poor, there were no toilets, you know, you could catch something and there'd be no doctors, or you didn't have any money, or you were drinking ale because the water was terrible. It's pretty bad, and yet funny, right? Lots of humour in there, lots of material for humour. And that is apparently how Shakespeare responded to the world, although he was probably wealthy enough not to have suffered in the way that the very poor would have. But nevertheless, you know, if you see a lot of suffering, it's reflected in you, and you know the world's like that. So his response to sometimes is comedy, you know, and sometimes is tragedy. So that's part of it, but does that mean, or should we interpret the play, or the meaning of the play, as being a sign that we ought not to take love too seriously? Well, the fact that love is a very major theme in the play, I think suggests that it is important. So if we could differentiate between serious and important, it's very, very important. You know, I mean, obviously this type of romantic love is sort of like lampooned or satirized by Helena walking around the forest, you know, saying to Demetrius, you know, I'll be your spaniel, you know, which, I mean, obviously a force that could reduce you to that is something that you'd need to, you know, be cautious of, because, you know, what's happening to our self-respect and all those things. But at the same time, for the four young people in the Athenian night, you know, in the crazy sort of like forest interactions, nothing's more important to them than romantic love. You know, they're willing to forgo all respectability, you know, all society, you know, all, you know, all of the life they've known is something that they'll just completely give up. And the reason is that it's a force and a reality and a truth, sort of an emotional internal truth, a preciousness, a value that occurs in these sort of interactions that nothing parallels. You know, they will literally run away, you know, into a completely unknown night, darkness, for the love of it, for the value of it. So, you know, is that a paradox? You know, I guess in some ways it is, if we're saying it's the most important thing, but we don't always have to take it too seriously. And obviously we can sort of hold a tension between those things, which is, I think, pretty good, really. I mean, one of the reasons why we're still talking about this play now, hundreds of years later, is that though its language be archaic, its themes be still current, you know, and we're still able to find a lot of satisfaction and meaning and sort of like identification, really, with the genius of the playwright. And we're reading it today. This is 2025. So I make no apology for saying this, that there are some aspects of the play now which, you know, to a contemporary mindset, so our understanding of equity, you know, and not sort of avoiding prejudice and bias, has come a long way from Shakespeare's time. So, for example, we wouldn't walk around saying a Jew, which could be, you know, that wasn't anywhere near the worst anti-Semitism of the day, but it stands out today as being a little bit Why are you highlighting the ethnicity of this person when they're already stigmatized? You know, it's sort of like not necessarily an Indian boy, the spiced Indian knight. And this is something that Edward Said would have called Orientalism, which is the idea that from the West, that in the East everything's really exotic, you know. And I think if you went there, you could have a wonderful sensual experience of something we might say is exotic, but the danger of that is that it gets reduced to exotic, or the complexity of it, you know, the three-dimensionalness of it sort of gets lost. You know, almost like, you know, think about the ancient world and you might think about, you know, Rome and Greece, you know, like the great precursors of Western civilization. And sort of, okay, what about Alexandria or Carthage, you know, or Troy? Tell me something about that, or the Persian Empire, you know, or the Mesopotamian. And it's coming a bit more online now, but they're not as well known. So, you know, so the West view of the East, as it was, is encapsulated here as a sort of a reductive and sort of like making it into something sort of like exotic. The role of men in the play, including the male fairy king and Theseus, the Athenian duke, they both have a lot more power than their female counterparts. Hippolyta has to agree to everything that Theseus says, and in the end, Titania is totally subject to the power and will of Oberon, which I think these days we'd find that a bit patriarchal, and we read it now as a sort of a memory, really, of how things were. I mean, in that Athenian and fairy world, everything's all wrong, you know, until the men sort of like step in and take action. Oberon has to step in to, you know, like drug his wife and bewitch his wife, and sort of like therefore he can sort of like appropriate the Indian boy into his possession for the first time, and then at the same time, you know, he mixes all the potions and sets the lovers in the right order in the end, although with a bit of mischief from Puck, and then Theseus has to go out walking the dogs, or, you know, going out in the morning, and then he comes across them, and then he's able to overrule Aegeus, who's also a patriarch with potentially too much power. But, you know, at least Theseus does something that seems just, which is he allows the repairing of the two couples to sort of stay as it is, and overrules the father's wishes. But again, they're both very male decisions, resonant of the sort of patriarchy that, you know, Shakespeare's would have seemed, you know, the case for Shakespeare. Certainly as well, if you write a play, you know, at that time, but looking back to some extent to ancient Greece. But, I mean, the interesting thing about that, I'm thinking now, is that Elizabeth I was potentially the monarch in England at the time, really. But nevertheless, the patriarchy is very much there. And what can we say about these fairies and the interaction of fairy world and like Greek world, or, you know, human world? And I mean, one of the things we can say is that, you know, it's a bit like the Greek gods. You know, they're a bit like the Greek gods. If you are more raised in a sort of Muslim or Christian, sort of like monotheistic book, sort of like based religion, then they're not gods like that, really. They're much more gods like Jupiter, or, you know, Zeus, the Greek and the Roman versions, Aphrodite, Venus. You know, Aphrodite sort of like, you know, am I beautiful? You know, I don't mind if I cause a war. You know, I'll hold a competition, and then, you know, I don't care if the outcome of my decisions in heaven causes a war on earth. And the fairies are like that, really, because the rift between Oberon and Titania has caused all kinds of problems with the harvest and the normal functioning of the natural world on Earth. Titania's a bit worried about it. Come with me, you know, and let's go, you know, around and do our night vigil stuff, and then, you know, that will set the world back to its rights. But Oberon doesn't care in the way that Zeus or Jupiter, or one of the sort of like flippant, you know, self-centered Greek gods wouldn't have cared. So it's that kind of thing. So, I mean, if we obviously don't necessarily think that Shakespeare's sort of cosmology was that he really thought that gods were like that or that the supernatural world was like that. I do think it points to, though, what perhaps he would have said that, regardless of that, there do seem to be barriers, problems, sprites, pixies. This is to do with the ghost in the machine as well. Forgive my pronunciation, but Deus ex machina, or the trickster archetype, the Jungian trickster archetype. If you know Loki in the Marvel films, you've got Loki, who's a lot of fun, but is he going to help you? Is he going to throw you under the bus? You never really know. And I think this also equates to what we have called Murphy's Law. You've lost your keys and you can't find them, and you're like, well, then they're in the last place you looked, or they seem to be in a place where you've already looked, and so Shakespeare's certainly pointing to human experience, having a question about, is there something mischievous interfering with the everyday running of my reality, really? I think without necessarily having, I don't think it's a statement of a cosmological view. Obviously it has a lot of dramatic possibilities as well, because Puck can come on and be a kind of interfering kind of like spirit, and he has the power. It's sort of like a puppet master. He can pull some strings at Oberon's request. Now, this could be a bit of a reach, but whereas in a novel you have sort of direct speech where characters are talking, which in a play is almost wholly that, apart from stage directions and set and so on. In a book, you can have direct speech, but you can also have this authorial voice. Little did they know Puck had a plan for them. This sort of like omniscient voice, or what have you. But Puck and Oberon, the power they exhibit enables sort of like Shakespeare to have a reason to sort of like come in and sort of like pull some strings, really. Otherwise, he'd have limited power. Events would have to play out, as it were, in a cause and effect relationship that would be comprehensible to us, which might be, the way the girls, Hermia and Helena, when they're arguing, when Hermia is saying something like, is it because I'm short? Look at you, you're so tall, because you're so tall, you've won his affection, you've won his love, and then they're riffing on this idea about her being short, and then Demetrius, sends her away like you bead, I can't remember all of them, but he's got a number of words that indicate that her stature or her size is short. So you might argue that cause and effect, as we understand it from basic sort of human factors, is something that we could point to and say, okay, I see why someone would find her attractive or not find her attractive, but it seems like Shakespeare's sort of like saying that doesn't really explain love, because love has got some much more incomprehensible things in it than that, and therefore we need the fairies to sort of stand in for the mystery of love, the incomprehensibleness. I mean, the symbol really in the play of the, at times, incomprehensibleness of why someone falls in love or why are these two people together or what have you, is obviously where Bottom has the donkey's head on. But Titania is so blinded by the love potion that it doesn't deter her at all. In fact, she goes, oh, your ears, your long ears, the donkeyness of his head becomes the literal focus of like what she's finding attractive in that particular point of view, which is obviously very, very absurd and it's exaggerated, but it points to the use of like classic sort of rationalism or something like logic to explain, love is not really going to work for you. To some extent, it could be, because your eyes are nice or your hair's nice or what have you, but that won't explain, if it was statistics, that would explain a certain proportion of the difference, but not all of it. In fact, not an awful lot of it, really. And that's a point very, very well made. And I think once you've seen the play, you understand it. It's something that you can't unsee, really, that that's something that actually does go on in the world. But I think coming back to this barriers question, so although the barriers are obviously the barriers to true love are there in Romeo and Juliet, and the barriers to true love are there in Pyramus and Thisbe. The barriers to true love are also there in the relationship between Lysander and Hermia. Principally, her father doesn't want them to be the ones who get together. But the role of the fairies actually is to sort of take these barriers away, So whereas Romeo and Juliet didn't have a fairy world or a cosmological dimension in which their problems could be fixed, fortunately Lysander and Hermia do, and Demetrius and Helena do. So their barriers to love were removed. One, a social barrier, and one, a sort of something that today we read like, well, he wasn't really, there was no compliance from him, there was no consent from him. You just didn't remove the magic potion and kind of sat on his eyes, and that was the end of that, really. But nevertheless, from Helena's point of view, a barrier to love was removed. And I think this is, from a contemporary viewpoint, is very interesting because, I don't know if you know the comedian Trevor Noah, but in his set, he talks about his mixed race parentage and about the fact that in South Africa, under the regime, his mum, who was a black South African woman, and his dad, who was white Swiss, they had to walk down separate sides of the road, and they couldn't be seen together in case the police force of the time would arrest them. So Trevor Noah's, it seems incredible now that a child and a man like him, people could have found that there was something illegal or unpleasant or unpalatable about that. And that's how far we've come. And that's, changed a lot in the last 50 years. And a racial barrier to love, has been removed. And countries all around the world are coming to different conclusions, but are compelled to consider whether they will allow gay people to love each other. And that's something that wouldn't have been the case. That's a very complex history. And if you read Foucault, he'll say, well, one of the reasons it wasn't debated was because we didn't really have this sort of like socio-historical concept in the same way, it's sort of that technology. It was a technology of repression, and we might be sort of like trying to undo it now. I'm going a bit off piste here, but the point is that there'll be, a number of factors that people will point to, and people will have their own views about, not that, so can these two people actually love each other? And there'll be all kinds of reasons. If you listen to 1 million conversations on that, you'll see a whole load of factors why some people will say that they can't, from the wrong side of the city, the wrong social class, this relationship must just be transactional, he's handsome and she's not beautiful, he's got a PhD and she's not got that kind of education, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And I think, although class divisions remain within Shakespeare, I think overall the idea is that there's a movement towards removing these barriers appropriately. I don't mean therefore we can go and do harm, or that where one intention is different, there's a power difference and one intends simply to use up another person. There's a whole load of reasons why there's a morality or an ethics of no, that's not okay. But there's a mix. Like I think my take on my personal response is, and I think it's in line with the play, there's a mix of these things, and each society or each person has to analyse their own sort of like received views on this, and to consider which ones to keep and which ones not really. And it seems like Shakespeare was apt to throw a few of them away, really. And that's interesting because, Romeo and Juliet, as I said, I'm actually wrapping up now. Romeo and Juliet, as I said, was based on the myth of Pyramus and Thisbe. which was Babylonian, which means it was much, much older than even Shakespeare, which is already pretty old. So this, I mean, sometimes, you know, these old myths would have had a sort of cosmological significance at the time, like they could have been linked to creation stories or explanations of how things happened, the old stories. But obviously, as I already said, when a story lasts this long, you have the privilege of perhaps understanding how it would have been intended at the time and how it's read now. And for a long time, Pyramus and Thisbe will have been read and understood as that there are barriers to true love, and they can seem inexplicable and wrong to the people who are in love. So that's something that's still an ongoing thing today. So I haven't attempted to cover everything there, but that was really sort of like what was on my heart to say about the play. The video's here, so if any of it's useful and you're doing an exam or you're interested, watch it again, take notes, something in the comments. If any of my students got to the end, congratulations, you'll probably get an A now. And what a laugh, you know, even if we're not laughing out loud, it genuinely is a real riot at the play. So glad it's on the syllabus, eh?